My brother Johnny bought a broken katana at a flea market for just $14 and challenged me. What could I possibly make from something completely useless like this? An idea came to me immediately. First, I disassembled the katana and removed the handle. Then I marked the blade every 8 centimeters and cut it into sections using an angle grinder. In the end, I had 7 separate pieces. I stacked them together, welded both ends, and created a solid billet ready for forging. Then I fired up my charcoal forge and placed the billet deep into the fire. After a while, it became red hot and the real work began. I cleaned the surface with a steel wire brush and sprinkled borax over the billet to drive oxygen out from between the layers and help them weld together. Then I gently hammered it from every side. I repeated the process several times. Wire brushing, borax, heat, and hammering. Once the layers had begun to bond, I forged it more aggressively until everything fused into one solid piece of steel. Then I decided to make it even more unique. While the billet was still red hot, I clamped it in a vise and twisted it. This forced the layers to flow together even more, creating a much more interesting pattern. After that, I forged the twisted billet into a flat bar about 4 millimeters thick. Then I forged the tang and finally shaped the blade tip. That concluded the forging stage. The next morning, I moved to the belt grinder. First, I leveled both sides because hammer marks were still visible. Then I refined the profile until the final blade shape began to appear. There were a few places the belt grinder couldn't reach, so I finished those details by hand with a file. Next came the most important step, grinding the bevels. As I've said before, this is the most critical part of knife making because it determines both the knife's appearance and how well it performs. I also refined the spine of the blade using a 240 grit belt. Then I fired up the forge once again, heated the blade to approximately 850 degrees Celsius, and quickly quenched it in oil. Now the steel was extremely hard and durable. After that, I sanded the blade from 150 grit all the way to 2000 grit before placing it into ferric chloride. The beautiful pattern became much more visible. Next came the bolster. This time, I made it from a piece of leaf spring steel. I cut it to size, drilled it, and carefully filed the slot until it fit the tang perfectly. I also prepared a thin orange Textilite spacer that would sit between the bolster and the handle. Then I took a block of walnut wood, cut it to size, marked the drilling points, drilled the hole, and refined it with a file until the fit was perfect. After that, I assembled everything using epoxy. The bolster, the orange spacer, and the walnut handle were all glued together. The next day, after the epoxy had fully cured, I shaped the handle on the belt grinder using a 36 grit belt. I drew the final handle profile and carefully finished shaping it. Then I hand sanded the wood to 240 grit and applied protective wood wax to keep moisture out and preserve the handle. Finally, I sharpened the blade to 4000 grit. Now it's incredibly sharp. And this is the final result. I think the experiment was definitely worth it. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video.